If you travel to South Texas, to San Patricio County, local old-timers will advise you not to walk near the banks of the Nueces River at night, especially when fog rolls in from the Gulf of Mexico and the wind starts whistling through the thorny branches of the mesquite trees. They say on such nights, you can see a woman there. She doesn't walk on the ground. She floats above it in a dirty white shroud. If you look closely, you can see her neck is unnaturally bent, and on her throat, a deep, dark mark from a rope is visible. She doesn't scream, and she doesn't try to scare you. She cries. Her quiet moan, "No soy culpable, I am not guilty," mingles with the sound of the river and vanishes into the darkness. This is Chipita Rodriguez, the woman who became the most terrifying ghost in Texas, because Texas made a ghost out of her with its own hands. To understand her tragedy, we must transport ourselves back to 1863. It was the time of the U.S. Civil War. While cannons thundered at Gettysburg in the north, here on the wild southern border, their own laws ruled. Or, more accurately, the complete absence thereof. It was a land of smugglers, deserters, horse thieves, and desperados. Chipita Rodriguez did not fit into this world of cruel men. She was already over 60, a respectable age for that time. She was Mexican by origin, which in the Texas of those days automatically made her a second-class citizen. She lived in isolation, in a shack amidst the dense brush country near the Nueces River. Her home was grandly called a hotel, but it wasn't a hotel in our understanding. It was a simple wooden shack with a palm leaf roof and a dirt floor. Chipita earned a living by providing travelers with shelter and hot food. Weary riders traveling the Cotton Road to Mexico knew. At old Chipita's, you could get a plate of beans, a corn cake, and a corner to sleep under a roof rather than in the rain. She did not live alone. A man named Juan Silvera lived with her. Who he was remains unknown to this day. Some said he was her helper. Others whispered that he was her illegitimate son, whom she had borne in her youth and protected all her life. Juan was a simple-minded man, quiet and obedient. They lived poorly but peacefully, trying not to attract the attention of the authorities. But in 1863 Texas, being a poor Mexican woman living at a crossroads of trade routes was dangerous. The atmosphere in the county was tense. English-speaking settlers viewed Mexicans with suspicion, considering them bandits or spies. Chipita knew this. She tried to be invisible. She was a small, frail woman who wished no one harm. She simply wanted to live out her days by the river. But fate had other plans. In August 1863, the sky over San Patricio grew heavy with clouds. A storm was brewing, and along with the first drops of rain, a horseman rode up to the door of her shack, carrying in his saddlebag something that was worth more than an old woman's life. He was carrying gold. August 1863. John Savage was a man of his time, a tough, pragmatic horse trader. In the heat of the Civil War, horses were the most valuable commodity. The Confederate Army needed cavalry, and Savage was making good money driving herds. That day, he was returning from a successful deal. His path lay to Brownsville, but the South Texas weather decided to make its own adjustments. The sky turned black, and a downpour began, turning the dusty roads into a swamp. Savage knew it was dangerous to ride on, but he worried even more about his cargo. In his saddlebags, alforjas, he carried $600 in gold coins. In today's money, this seems like a small sum, but in 1863, in a poor border region, it was a fortune. With this money, you could buy a ranch or kill a man. Soaked to the bone, Savage saw a light in the brush near the Nueces River. It was Chipita Rodriguez's shack. He knew this place. Many travelers stopped here. Chipita had a reputation as a hospitable hostess who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Savage knocked on the door. Chipita let him in. She saw a tired man nervously clutching his bags. She offered him supper, a simple meal of corn and meat, and a place to sleep on the porch, a common custom of the time, as there was little space inside the shack. Juan Silvera was also in the house. He silently watched the guest. Almost no testimony remains of what happened that evening. We only know that Savage was cautious. He likely checked his gold before sleep, and the glint of coins in the oil lamp's light could have blinded anyone watching from the darkness. The night was restless. Thunder shook the walls of the shack. Rain lashed the palm-thatched roof. This noise would have reliably masked any screams or sounds of struggle. Morning came. The rain stopped. The sun began to scorch the earth again. But John Savage was no longer on the porch. His horse was nowhere to be seen either. Chipita and Juan continued about their business as if nothing had happened. Perhaps the guest just left at dawn? This was common for traders who wanted to cover as many miles as possible before the heat hit. But a few days later, downstream on the Nueces River, locals noticed something strange in the water. They pulled a burlap sack onto the bank. Inside was a body. It was John Savage. The scene was gruesome. He wasn't just killed, he was hacked. A deep axe wound had split his head open. The body had obviously been thrown into the river, hoping the current would carry it into the bay to be eaten by alligators or fish. But driftwood snagged the terrible cargo. Most importantly, the gold was not with him. The saddlebags had vanished. News of the white trader's murder instantly flew through the county. In the eyes of the local English-speaking settlers, this wasn't just a robbery. It was a challenge. Everyone knew where Savage had stayed last. All eyes turned to the lonely shack in the mesquite thickets. Sheriff William Means, hearing of the discovery, didn't conduct a complex investigation. To him, everything was obvious. The Mexican woman and her helper saw the gold, killed the gringo, and dumped the evidence in the water. He got on his horse and rode to arrest Chipita Rodriguez. He didn't yet know that he had no direct evidence of her guilt, but in 1863 Texas, that was no obstacle to the gallows. When Sheriff William Means rode up to Chipita's shack, he didn't feel like a detective unraveling a complex case. He felt like the punishing hand. For him, as for most white men in San Patricio County, the arithmetic was simple. Dead white trader. Last place of lodging with a Mexican woman. Therefore, the Mexican woman is guilty. Means entered the shack without a warrant and without knocking. Chipita sat by the fire, sorting beans. Seeing the sheriff, she wasn't scared. In those times, people were used to visits from armed men. But when Means roughly grabbed her by the arm and started shouting something in English, she realized something terrible had happened. She spoke almost no English. Her world was limited to Spanish and a few words needed for trading with travelers. She tried to ask, "¿Qué pasa?" What is happening? But the sheriff wasn't listening. He began turning her poor dwelling upside down. He was looking for gold. The very $600 John Savage was carrying. The sheriff slashed open straw mattresses, overturned pots, and dug up the dirt floor. The result? Nothing. Not a single gold coin. No expensive items that would indicate sudden wealth. Chipita was as poor as ever. But the sheriff found something else. On the floor of the porch where Savage had slept, he noticed dark stains. Blood? Maybe. Or maybe it was the blood of a chicken chopped for dinner, or the blood of a deer brought by a hunter. In 1863, no one did DNA tests. To Sheriff Means, any stain was proof of murder. Meanwhile, downstream, where Savage's body was found, an event occurred that should have completely exonerated Chipita. The search party found the gold. The saddlebags with coins lay on the river bottom, tangled in roots, not far from where the body had surfaced. This discovery should have stopped the investigation. Think logically. If Chipita, an old, frail woman, killed a burly man for money, why would she throw the money into the river? It made no sense. Murder for robbery implies the killer takes the loot. The fact that the gold lay in the water with the body suggested entirely different thoughts. Perhaps Savage was killed elsewhere and the current brought him here? Or the killer got scared and dumped everything in the water? Or was it revenge, not robbery? But Sheriff Means rejected logic. He had his own version. The old witch and her bastard one killed him, then got scared and tried to get rid of the evidence by dumping everything in the river. He arrested both, Chipita Rodriguez and Juan Silvera. They were shackled in irons. It was a pathetic procession. Juan, scared to death, walked with his head down. Chipita, a small, gray-haired woman, barely moved her legs in the dust, trying to preserve a shred of dignity. They were brought to the jail in San Patricio. It wasn't just a cell. It was a pit. The prison was a damp, dark room where prisoners were often kept chained to the wall. Chipita found herself the center of attention. People came to look at her like an animal in a zoo. Locals whispered, "Look, that's the Mexican woman who chopped up the traitor with an axe." No one cared that she physically couldn't have handled a strong man. No one thought about the fact that the gold was found in the river. A heavy, sticky hatred hung in the air. There was a war on. People were embittered. They needed someone to blame. And the old Mexican woman fit the role perfectly. She was other. She was easy prey. Sheriff Means reported to the judge. Case closed, killers caught. He didn't know that by his actions, he was starting a mechanism that, 100 years later, would make the entire state of Texas blush with shame. The trial in San Patricio took place in a building that resembled a barn more than a temple of justice. The walls were thin, the floorboards creaked, and the air inside was stale with tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. Judge Benjamin Neal took his seat at the table. Before him in the dock sat two people, Juan Silvera, whose entire body was trembling, and Chipita Rodriguez, who sat upright, staring into the void. From the very beginning, this trial was a theater of the absurd. First, the language barrier. The trial was conducted in English. Chipita understood almost nothing of what the prosecutor, witnesses, and judge were saying. She was not provided with an interpreter. She sat listening to an alien language that was deciding whether she would live or die, able only to guess the nature of the accusations by the angry intonations. Second, the jury. 12 men sat in the box. All white, all locals. Some of them personally knew Sheriff Means. Others had perhaps even seen Savage's body. What impartiality could there be? To them, the defendants were guilty simply because they were Mexicans at a time when racial tension had reached its peak. The prosecutor's evidence was, to put it mildly, scant. Savage spent the night at Chipita's. Savage was found dead. There were some stains on Chipita's porch, never identified by anyone as human blood. Where was the gold? No one could explain why a robber would throw the loot into the river. Where was the murder weapon? The axe was never linked to the crime. How did an old woman overpower a man? This question wasn't even asked. But the most mysterious aspect of this trial was Chipita's silence. Her lawyer, if he could be called that, asked almost no questions. But Chipita herself made no attempt to exonerate herself. Historians still debate why. The most popular and tragic version: she was protecting Juan. Many believe that Juan Silvera was her illegitimate son. Perhaps it was he, young and strong, who killed Savage, accidentally or intentionally. And Chipita, as a mother, decided to take the blame or simply remain silent so as not to testify against him. She looked at Juan with sadness, but she did not say a single word that would condemn him. Juan Silvera received his sentence first. He was found guilty of complicity, but was given only 5 years in prison. Why did the accomplice get such a lenient sentence, while the ringleader, an old woman, was to bear the full weight of the punishment? When the jury returned from deliberations regarding Chipita, they delivered a verdict that would go down in history as one of the most contradictory. The jury foreman announced, "Guilty of murder in the first degree." But then he added a postscript, written on a scrap of paper with a trembling hand. "But we recommend mercy due to her old age and frailty." It was an admission of their own hypocrisy. It was as if the jurors were saying, "We know the evidence is weak. We see she is old and frail, that she physically could hardly have done this. But we want to punish someone, so we will convict her, but we will pass the responsibility for her life onto the judge." They hoped Judge Neal would commute the death sentence to imprisonment. But Judge Benjamin Neal was in no mood for mercy. He looked at the small woman who didn't understand what was happening and banged his gavel. Sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence to be carried out on Friday, November 13th. Chipita did not gasp. She only clutched the crucifix she wore closer to her body. The crowd in the hall buzzed. Even the toughest cowboys felt a chill run down their spines. Hang a woman? An old one? This had never been done in Texas. But the death machine had already been set in motion, and only the governor could stop it, but he was too far away and too busy with the war to think about some old Mexican woman on the banks of the Nueces River. It was a Friday. A day that superstitious people consider unlucky became fatal for Chipita Rodriguez. The morning was quiet. San Patricio lacked its usual bustle. People spoke in whispers, as if afraid to break the heavy silence hanging over the town. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Sheriff William Means arrived at the cell. Chipita was already waiting. She hadn't slept all night. She had put on her best dress, simple, faded for washing, but clean. She had braided her gray hair. She was ready. When she was led outside, the blinding Texas sun struck her eyes. She squinted, inhaling the air that smelled of dust and dry grass. San Patricio had no scaffold. The town was small, and no one expected to have to officially hang anyone. That is why the sheriff's improvisation looked particularly macabre. An ordinary wagon, hitched to mules, stood near the jail. Inside the wagon lay a simple wooden coffin. Chipita was ordered to sit on it. She sat upon the coffin destined for her own body. The procession moved out. The wagon rolled slowly along the rocky road, its wheels creaking. Behind it walked the sheriff, a few of his deputies, and a crowd of onlookers. But in this crowd, there was none of the excitement often seen at public executions of the time. Men averted their eyes. Women crossed themselves. Everyone saw not a monster, but a little grandmother riding to her death. They stopped outside of town, on the banks of the Nueces River. The spot was not chosen by chance. An old, wind-twisted mesquite tree grew here. Its branches were strong and thorny. One of them, particularly thick, hung over the road. It was a gallows created by nature. Sheriff Means stopped the wagon so that Chipita was directly under the branch. He threw a rope over the tree and tied a knot. The other end, with the noose, swayed before the woman's face. Chipita was ordered to stand. She rose onto the coffin. Her legs were weak, but she stood tall. The sheriff asked if she had any last words. She didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't cry. She looked at the sheriff with her dark eyes and said quietly in Spanish, "No soy culpable." I'm not guilty. These were the only words that mattered. Then she began to whisper a prayer. The executioner, who was either the sheriff himself or his deputy, placed the noose around her neck. The rough hemp rope cut into her wrinkled skin. The moment of truth had arrived. The executioner cracked the whip at the mules. The wagon lurched forward. The coffin, which had been Chipita's foothold, rolled away with the wagon. Chipita Rodriguez was left hanging in the air. Death by hanging is not always quick. If the neck doesn't break instantly, the person dies of strangulation. It is a terrible, agonizing death. The old woman's body swayed beneath the mesquite tree. Her skirt fluttered in the wind. A dead silence stood all around, broken only by the creaking of the branch. She became the only woman legally executed in Texas for over 100 years. The next execution of a woman would not occur until 1998. When the doctor finally pronounced her dead, the body was taken down. But even in death, Chipita found no peace. The priest refused to bury a murderess on the consecrated ground of the church cemetery. They put her back in that same coffin and buried her in a shallow grave outside the cemetery fence, among weeds and stones. No cross, no name. Like a dog, the crowd dispersed. Sheriff Means returned home, believing he had done his duty. But that very night, the residents of San Patricio heard a strange sound coming from the direction of the river. It was a sound like the quiet weeping of a woman. And from that moment, the legend of the ghost began to take on a life of its own, haunting those who had carried out this judgment. When the sun set below the horizon on November 13th, 1863, San Patricio plunged into a darkness that seemed thicker than usual. Chipita Rodriguez was dead. Her body lay in the damp earth, outside the church fence. For a Catholic, this was the final and most terrible insult, to be buried like a suicide or a heretic without a blessing in unclean ground. But the earth, it seems, refused to accept this injustice in silence. 122 years passed. During this time, Texas changed beyond recognition. The Wild West became history. Horses gave way to automobiles, and mesquite thickets turned into cities. But the case of Chipita Rodriguez remained an open wound on the state's conscience. In the 1980s, a group of historians and lawyers led by Keith Guthrie decided to dig up the truth, not with shovels, but in archives. What they found in dusty boxes in the basement of the San Patricio County courthouse confirmed the worst suspicions. The documents proved the trial of Chipita was a farce. No direct evidence. The gold was not found in her possession. The jury's recommendation for mercy was ignored by the judge. It became obvious that the state of Texas had executed an innocent woman simply because she was a convenient target. The senator and his battle. State Senator Carlos Truan took up this cause. For him, it was a matter of honor. He understood he couldn't resurrect Chipita, but he could restore her good name. He prepared a document that was to change history. It was Senate Resolution Number 13. The text of the resolution was unprecedented. It did not ask for a pardon, since a pardon implies forgiveness for a crime committed. It asserted that no crime on Chipita's part had been proven, and that the trial was unfair. June 13, 1985. A solemn atmosphere reigned in the Texas state capitol in Austin. Governor Mark White sat at the table, took a pen, and signed the resolution. With his signature, the state of Texas officially recognized Chipita Rodriguez did not receive a fair trial. She was posthumously absolved of the charges of murdering John Savage. It was a historic moment. For the first time in U.S. history, a state officially exonerated a person executed more than a century ago. Peace for the soul? What did this change? Legally, everything. Chipita's name was cleansed of the stain of a murderer. Physically, nothing. She was still dead. But spiritually, it held immense significance. Today, Chipita Rodriguez is no longer considered a criminal. She is a symbol. Books are written about her, such as The Legend of Chipita by Rachel Bard. Operas are staged. Composer Joseph Summers wrote the opera Chipita Rodriguez, and places are named after her. Legend says that after the resolution was signed, the moans near the Nueces River grew quieter. Some believe her spirit finally got what she begged for that fatal night on the scaffold. She was heard. But locals still tell that on especially dark, foggy nights, when the wind sways the branches of the old mesquite, one can see a pale female figure. She no longer cries about her innocence. She simply looks at the world of the living, reminding us of the fragility of justice. The story of Chipita Rodriguez teaches us that the law is not always justice. Sometimes the law can be the cruelest killer, but also teaches us hope. Hope that the truth, even buried in a nameless grave, even after 100 years, is capable of breaking through the stones and declaring itself. Justice for Chipita came too late to save her life, but just in time to save her memory. Legend says that the very night Sheriff Means went to bed, he couldn't sleep. From the direction of the river, from the lonely grave under the mesquite tree, a sound began to drift. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the howling of coyotes. It was a quiet, drawn-out woman's weeping. People living on the outskirts swore they heard a voice repeating the same phrase, interrupted by the rasp of strangulation. No soy culpable. No soy culpable. Cowboys, who usually feared neither devil nor bullet, began to give the old mesquite tree a wide berth. They told tales of seeing a light in its branches, like a ghostly lantern, or the silhouette of a small woman with an unnaturally elongated neck. The tree itself, where Chipita was hung, became cursed. According to legend, after the execution, it began to wither. The leaves fell, the branches dried up and turned black, but the tree didn't die completely. It stood like a skeleton, reminding the town of the sin committed. The grass stopped growing beneath it. Even in the rainy season, when all of Texas turned green, the circle under Chipita's tree remained bare, scorched earth. Over the years, Chipita's image merged with another famous legend, La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. But the ghost of San Patricio had her own distinct feature. She was described as a woman in a white shroud, or that same faded dress, with a rope around her neck. She appeared to travelers, especially men riding on horseback. She didn't attack. She simply looked them in the eye with her deep, sorrowful gaze, making horses rear and freezing the blood of the riders. They say Chipita appeared every time a woman was scheduled to be executed in the county court, as if trying to warn or protect the new victim. For a long time, historians considered Chipita's story just a scary folktale. Court documents had burned or been lost. The grave was overgrown. Many doubted she existed at all. But the truth has a way of surfacing, sometimes literally. In 1914, according to other accounts, later, during road work, workers dug up the ground on the edge of the old San Patricio Cemetery. A shovel struck wood. They pulled out a coffin. It was old, rotten, filled with dirt. When they opened it, they found a female skeleton inside. But the most terrifying detail was what lay among the neck bones. The remains of the rope had rotted, but metal elements or the petrified not remained. It was her, Chipita. She really had been buried outside the fence like an outcast. This discovery shocked the community. People realized the legend wasn't fiction. This was a real woman who had lain in a nameless pit for half a century while the town tried to forget its crime. Finding the bones didn't bring her peace immediately. She was reburied, but the spirit of her story continued to trouble the living. Now it wasn't just mysticism. It was a historical reproach. And years later, there were people who decided it was time to remove the news from the neck of her memory. 122 years passed. During this time, Texas changed beyond recognition. The Wild West became history. Horses gave way to automobiles, and mesquite thickets turned into cities. But the case of Chipita Rodriguez remained an open wound on the state's conscience. In the 1980s, a group of historians and lawyers led by Keith Guthrie decided to dig up the truth, not with shovels, but in archives. What they found in dusty boxes in the basement of the San Patricio County courthouse confirmed the worst suspicions. The documents proved the trial of Chipita was a farce. No direct evidence. The gold was not found in her possession. The jury's recommendation for mercy was ignored by the judge. It became obvious that the state of Texas had executed an innocent woman simply because she was a convenient target. State Senator Carlos Truin took up this cause. For him, it was a matter of honor. He understood he couldn't resurrect Chipita, but he could restore her good name. He prepared a document that was to change history. It was Senate Resolution Number 13. The text of the resolution was unprecedented. It did not ask for a pardon, since a pardon implies forgiveness for a crime committed. It asserted that no crime on Chipita's part had been proven and that the trial was unfair. June 13, 1985. A solemn atmosphere reigned in the Texas state capitol in Austin. Governor Mark White sat at the table, took a pen, and signed the resolution. With this signature, the state of Texas officially recognized Chipita Rodriguez did not receive a fair trial. She was posthumously absolved of the charges of murdering John Savage. It was a historic moment. For the first time in U.S. history, a state officially exonerated a person executed more than a century ago. What did this change? Legally, everything. Chipita's name was cleansed of the stain of a murderer. Physically, nothing. She was still dead, but spiritually, it held immense significance. Today, Chipita Rodriguez is no longer considered a criminal. She's a symbol. Books are written about her, such as The Legend of Chipita by Rachel Bard. Operas are staged. Composer Joseph Summers wrote the opera Chipita Rodriguez, and places are named after her. Legend says that after the resolution was signed, the moans near the Nueces River grew quieter. Some believe her spirit finally got what she begged for that fatal night on the scaffold. She was heard. But locals still tell that on especially dark, foggy nights, when the wind sways the branches of the old mesquite, one can see a pale female figure. She no longer cries about her innocence. She simply looks at the world of the living, reminding us of the fragility of justice. The story of Chipita Rodriguez teaches us that the law is not always justice. Sometimes the law can be the cruelest killer, but it also teaches us hope. Hope that the truth, even buried in a nameless grave, even after 100 years, is capable of breaking through the stones and declaring itself. Justice for Chipita came too late to save her life, but just in time to save our memory. The end.